of Americans who have no voice, no shield, and soon no future. Her hands remained steady on the polished wood before her, yet her breath hitched ever so slightly, betraying the emotional tremor buried beneath her carefully practiced composure. She did not need to shout. The silence of the chamber amplified every word. She let the words linger before leaning in her tone, dropping, "You don't get to pretend you don't know what this will do." When Medicaid is gutted, when children go to bed hungry, when entire families are thrown to the mercy of a system built to crush them, this chamber will bear that stain. A slight murmur rippled through the room, but no one spoke. No one interrupted. The weight of accusation had settled like lead. Then Gavin Newsom's voice, velvet smooth eyes, half-lidded, as though reading from history itself, pressed his fingertips together and addressed the chamber without raising his voice. Allocating $100 billion to ICE gentlemen is not policy, it is prelude. The construction of a domestic military apparatus that will not serve our people, but surveil and suppress them. We have seen this before in places we swore we would never emulate. We are not building safety, we are building fear. He paused just long enough to let his words cut deep. Trump entered without ceremony, accompanied by Kash Patel, both silent as stone. Neither man needed to announce themselves. The room shifted regardless. AOC caught their arrival, her gaze never leaving their faces as she continued, voice now stripped of pretense. You can frame this as security. You can dress it up in flags and slogans. But we know every soul in this chamber knows this is not about safety. It is about power. And when you cross this line, when you hand unchecked authority to men with no accountability, you will not be able to unmake the damage. Her breath faltered only slightly, but her chin lifted in defiance. Gavin's voice came again, soft but steely. We have studied history because we refuse to repeat it. Every regime that has descended into tyranny began with words like these, wrapped in promises of protection, while stripping away the dignity of the governed. The tension tightened. Not a cough, not a chair scrape. Kash Patel shifted his voice low, meant only for Trump, but caught by the nearest microphones. They're building a myth layered with sentiment and selective outrage. We'll dismantle it, one layer at a time. But let them speak. Trump's eyes narrowed, not with anger, not with haste, but with the cold precision of a man who knew exactly how long a battle must be allowed to brew before striking. For a moment, no one moved. The chamber felt frozen in time until the former president allowed his voice measured and flat as a guillotine's fall to cut through the silence. Tomorrow, Trump murmured, his eyes fixed not on his accusers, but on the idea itself. They'll remember every word they spoke tonight. And in that moment, without fanfare, without theatrics, the first stone of the coming war was set in motion. The weight of Donald Trump's final words from the previous night, words that had sliced through the chamber with surgical detachment, still hung like smoke when the hearing resumed the following morning. No one needed reminding. No one dared to speak first. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's eyes were glassy as she rose, not because of the cameras, not because of the pressure, but because the war she had framed as moral had just shifted into something more raw, more desperate. I never imagined that I would stand in this room and have to explain to my colleagues that 17 million Americans losing their Medicaid is not an abstract number. It is a graveyard being prepared in real time. She did not stop for breath. She let the words stack brick upon brick, each heavier than the last. They will die and no one will remember their names. They will die because we, those of us entrusted to govern, allowed a piece of legislation to do what no bullet, no bomb, no foreign adversary could ever do: erase lives through silence. There was no theatrical sobbing, but her voice cracked at the edges, and when she raised the printed charts, the Congressional Budget Office's stark projections of Medicaid cuts, the room flinched. Gavin Newsom followed seamlessly, his tone icy precise. We are not here to discuss politics. We are here to prevent a crime that is not just theoretical, but measurable, documentable, and if this bill is signed, inevitable. He paused, holding the room's full attention. Medicaid SNAP ACA subsidies slashed to the bone. Small business owners forced into bankruptcy by exploding healthcare costs. Children who relied on WIC left behind. All of this to funnel wealth into tax cuts for corporations whose profits already outpace the GDP of entire nations. His voice dipped lower. If we cannot call this theft, then we have no language left for justice. Throughout the assault, Trump and Patel remained motionless, their eyes locked on the witnesses, but their expressions unreadable. Not a word, not a glance between them. AOC, sensing the stillness, pressed harder. Mr. Trump, this isn't just the death of our social contract. It's the death of decency. You're not just killing dreams, you're killing people. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the papers down, but her chin did not falter. For a long moment, the room remained frozen. Then, without lifting his eyes, without raising his voice, Trump finally spoke, every syllable clipped and deliberate. There will come a time when you'll realize truth doesn't require tears. The words landed not as an attack, but as a quiet declaration, a refusal to engage on emotional terrain. Newsom shifted uncomfortably but did not reply. AOC exhaled, her breathing shallow. The momentum for now was still with them, but something in the air had shifted. The hearing recessed for the day, but as they filed out, one side buoyed by emotion, the other by calculation. The question of who truly held the upper hand remained suspended in the air. The room that had emptied the previous evening with such uneasy stillness now filled once more same faces, but this time the air carried the bitter weight of something irreversible. No applause, no murmurs. Only the methodical rustling of papers as both sides prepared for what they knew would not end with words alone. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez rose first, her voice softer, but tinged with the cold steel of defiance. Every signature on this bill is not just ink on paper. It is a bullet aimed squarely at the heart of justice itself. She paused deliberately, allowing the gravity of the metaphor to settle her hands, resting on the folder that contained the Congressional Budget Office's stark projections. Gavin Newsom followed without prompting, his voice smoother than silk, but no less lethal in its precision. Not a single human being was born to be reduced to columns on a balance sheet. Yet that is exactly what we are witnessing, people stripped of their names, their histories, and reduced to liabilities on a government ledger. The Senate floor remained silent, each word ricocheting off marble and wood, leaving no space for distraction. For a long moment, Donald Trump and Kash Patel remained statues, calm, unreadable. Then, without glancing at notes, Trump spoke, his voice low but resonant. We are not here to debate abstraction. We are here because there is a nation to preserve. There are borders that must mean something, laws that must be enforced, and yes, there are hard choices that must be made. Because when you strip away the slogans, when you remove the sentimentality, what remains is the simple truth. A country that cannot defend its borders is not a country at all. The words came without theatrics, without raised voices. They were measured, steady, and coldly factual. Kash Patel shifted forward, his tone equally controlled, every word weighted with quiet finality. We did not come here to be applauded. We came here because the very act of governance requires decisions that may not be fashionable, that may not be popular, but are nonetheless necessary if this republic is to endure. He glanced briefly toward the thick stack of policy reports, ICE operations, data crime statistics, economic impact models. For every story of hardship you present, Patel continued, his voice barely above a whisper, but laced with steel. There are stories of families devastated by crimes we could have prevented. There are entire communities living in fear because we have chosen time and again to privilege narrative over national security. The words landed not as emotional strikes, but as hard data dressed in human consequence. AOC straightened, refusing to cede the field. Security does not come at the price of human dignity. If you believe that a nation survives by abandoning its most vulnerable, then you are defending a shell, not a society. Her words drew a breath of tension from several senators, but the fatigue in her voice, the slight repetition of themes, did not go unnoticed. Newsom leaned in once more, attempting to anchor the emotional momentum. The cost of this bill is not simply financial, it is moral. What you are creating is not a safer America, but a divided one. But as the words faded, the dynamic had shifted. Trump did not immediately press the advantage. He remained quiet, his hands folded, his expression as still as the heavy drapes behind him. Patel mirrored the stillness, offering no further challenge. For now, they yielded the floor deliberately, strategically, allowing the emotional current to run its course, while holding back the hammer they both knew would fall. For several moments after the deliberate silence from Trump and Patel, the chamber seemed to hover in an uneasy equilibrium, words still lingering in the air. yet the weight of unspoken calculation pressing heavier. Sensing the pause, Gavin Newsom seized the floor with the polished ease of a man who understood that momentum in politics was not merely earned, but carefully orchestrated. If we are to speak of survival, Newsom began, his voice steady, yet edged with controlled urgency. Then let us speak in numbers that matter, not slogans, not rhetoric, but the real human cost that this chamber too often chooses to ignore. He shifted forward, glancing briefly at the assembled senators, before continuing without a tremor. Last year alone, over 31 million Americans remained uninsured or underinsured. That is not conjecture, it is the verified data from the Kaiser Family Foundation. Among them, thousands died from preventable causes, not because medicine failed, but because their access was denied. And let me be clear, the expansion of ICE, the redirection of federal funding, and the slashing of healthcare programs are not isolated decisions. They are interwoven, and the casualties will be counted in lives, not statistics. He allowed that image to sink in, no drama, only cold arithmetic dressed in quiet condemnation. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, still composed despite the strain in her voice, rose to reinforce the line of attack. You can sign 1,000 bills, but you cannot sign life back into bodies that have been buried. You cannot legislate away the grief of families who will lose everything because we, those entrusted to serve, decided that border walls mattered more than beating hearts. Her words were calculated for resonance, but they carried genuine fatigue. The weight of too many battles fought on too many fronts. Trump remained motionless, silent by design. Instead, it was Kash Patel who broke the stillness, his voice quiet yet unwavering, every syllable sharpened to surgical precision. We are not here to conquer anyone. We are here to remind this chamber of something it seems increasingly willing to forget: a nation that dissolves its borders into sentiment, a state that sacrifices its sovereignty on the altar of feelings, does not survive the test of history. He let the words land without raising his voice. The tears are real, but so too are the consequences of lawlessness. So too are the numbers: over 36,000 violent crimes linked to illegal border crossings in just the last fiscal year. Those too are lives, those too are families. The chamber shifted. Several senators exchanged uncertain glances. AOC, though visibly shaken, refused to yield. Statistics do not excuse cruelty. They do not justify abandoning the values we are meant to defend. Newsom added, swiftly pressing to regain control. Public safety does not require sacrificing democracy. We can secure our borders without transforming into a surveillance state. Yet despite the renewed volley, the undercurrent had shifted. For the first time, the room no longer belonged entirely to the emotional crescendo. Trump remained silent, his gaze fixed not on the speakers, but on the inevitability of the outcome. Patel folded his hands again, offering no further words. And across the aisle, AOC's eyes, though defiant, flickered with something darker doubt. The first visible fracture, the tension that had briefly fractured the composure of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the previous exchange, still lingered, clinging to the chamber's heavy air as she rose once more. Not with the firebrand certainty that had marked her earlier statements, but with a voice weighed down by something closer to quiet desperation. Her hands, no longer entirely steady, pressed against the edge of the podium as she exhaled and began. We can recite statistics. We can debate legal frameworks. But at the end of this process, Mr. President, it will not be numbers that lie beneath the ground. It will be people, human beings, mothers, fathers, children who depended on programs like SNAP, like WIC, like Medicaid systems of protection that this legislation will obliterate. Her words, though softly delivered, carried the faintest tremor, and when she lifted her gaze, her eyes flickered briefly toward the senators seated at the periphery. Gavin Newsom, his expression taut but composed, picked up the thread without hesitation. We cannot pretend that policy exists in a vacuum. When you freeze the minimum wage while stripping healthcare access, the outcome is not theoretical, it is mathematically predictable. Since the rollback of key ACA provisions, uninsured rates have climbed by over 5 million Americans, disproportionately impacting working-class families already stretched beyond endurance. He allowed the data to settle his fingers, tapping lightly against the dossier in front of him. Patel shifted slightly but did not immediately respond. AOC inhaled sharply, her voice lowering to a near whisper. Tell me, how do you measure the worth of a child who dies from a preventable illness because her mother had to choose between groceries and insulin? Tell me that borders matter more than breath. Look me in the eye and say that. The words were crafted to pierce not just Trump, but the conscience of every listener. Trump, however, did not blink. It was Kash Patel who leaned forward first. His voice measured each syllable. Deliberate, Madam Representative, you speak of tears, and I do not doubt their sincerity. But you seem unwilling, or perhaps unable, to confront the reality that those same tears flow in homes shattered by crimes committed by individuals who, by any legal measure, should never have set foot on this soil. He paused, his tone sharpening. We are not discussing abstractions. We are discussing 36,000 violent offenses linked directly to illegal entry. That is not conjecture. That is not ideology. That is hard data that has consequences when leaders choose to close their eyes. The chamber froze. There was no immediate reply. Trump, still seated, allowed himself a slight movement, a glance toward AOC, his voice low, almost conversational. Sometimes the very people you call victims are the ones inflicting the harm you refuse to acknowledge. The words, delivered without malice but with unflinching clarity, struck harder than any raised voice could. For a moment, no one moved. AOC's lips parted, but no sound came. Newsom shifted uncomfortably, his earlier momentum visibly faltering. Around the chamber, the silence deepened, not with the weight of agreement, but with the weight of uncertainty. The balance had shifted. The veneer of dominance held by the opposition, so meticulously constructed, had begun to crack. And though the confrontation had not yet reached its crescendo, the first definitive turning point had arrived. Kash Patel, seeing the weight of momentum begin to shift, decided it was no longer time to hold back. Let's stop pretending that emotion is a substitute for policy, or that crying on this floor changes the arithmetic that this nation has ignored for too long. He took one step closer to the center, voice steady. According to the Department of Homeland Security, violent crimes directly linked to illegal border crossings rose 37% in the past 18 months. I didn't make that up. You didn't refute it. And no family mourning a lost child due to a crime that never should have happened cares whether your narrative wins online. Trump, without standing, followed seamlessly. We don't have to fabricate a single detail. The data's there. The names of the victims are there. Their stories don't need hashtags, they need justice. And if you can't see that, then maybe it's not the system that's broken, but your priorities. AOC's voice, slightly hoarse, broke through. You say victims. Do you ever mention the children torn from their mothers at processing centers? Do you read the testimonies of 7-year-olds who had to watch their fathers be cuffed and dragged away? Or do those stories not count because they don't fit your spreadsheet? She pressed forward, undeterred. You throw numbers like daggers, but you refuse to see the faces behind them. I have seen those families. I have listened to them through plexiglass barriers. I have watched children speak in broken English, asking if their parents are gone forever. Newsom jumped in before Patel could respond. The expansion of ICE has already cost taxpayers over $13 billion annually. That's more than the combined budgets of the CDC and the Department of Education. We're funding trauma, not safety. But Patel didn't flinch, and his reply came hard and fast. We're funding enforcement of laws that Congress itself passed. Or are we now pretending that border control is a moral failing rather than a legal responsibility? He pointed slowly toward the folder he placed at his side. Here's what your talking points never include. The 36,000 violent crimes in the last fiscal year, the fentanyl seizures that doubled along open sectors, and the 47% spike in gang-related activity linked to unchecked migration flow. AOC's tone sharpened, her body leaning forward. And how many of those numbers were inflated through questionable classification? How many included petty arrests repackaged as major offenses to justify your next budget increase? Trump's still quiet, but now visibly focused, cutting question. The data all you want, but not a single victim buried, because we failed to act, will rise from the grave if you win this argument. AOC's hands trembled briefly on the edge of her notes, but she responded quickly. I'm not trying to win an argument. I'm trying to stop another child from being left in a holding cage, waiting for parents who may never return. Patel shook his head slowly. You've had 6 years to reform the asylum process. You've had multiple funding packages to upgrade facilities to ensure humane oversight. What you haven't had is the courage to accept that open borders and safe communities do not coexist. Newsom leaned in, voice low, as if to reclaim the tempo. And yet it's your party that weaponized fear, turning public service into performance. Tell me, when did policy become a branding strategy? Trump's answer was curt and unbending. Policy became survival the moment people started dying while you were still drafting speeches. The room once leaning toward AOC's fire and Newsom's fluency now sat in tension, unsure whether what they had witnessed was a turning point or simply a moment too sharp to ignore. And though no vote had been cast, no headline yet written, one thing was clear. The moral high ground was no longer anyone's to assume without contest. The air still hung heavy from Trump's cold final line in the previous round, and for a long moment no one spoke. Eyes darted, breaths held, but it was Trump himself who, without shifting in his seat, let the weight of his words settle before breaking the silence with deliberate calm. Every administration, Trump began, voice low, slow, calculated, has faced the same timeless choice: to shield its people or to surrender to temporary emotions. I've made my choice. I will defend Americans regardless of what names you call me for it. He didn't raise his voice because he didn't need to. His gaze sharp, steady, locked on AOC, who visibly recoiled, her fingertips pressing harder into her notes. Kash Patel, without waiting, stepped forward smoothly, voice measured but unwavering. We can speak in slogans, we can speak in poetry, but let's instead speak in names like Sandra D., who was stabbed to death by a repeat offender who entered this country illegally 3 separate times. Or John W., a father of 2, murdered during a carjacking by an undocumented gang member the system failed to deport. He held up the file not with flair, but with the gravity of undeniable evidence. These are not anecdotes. These are citizens who won't go home again because somewhere along the way this country decided that moral posturing mattered more than legal enforcement. AOC's voice broke slightly as she cut in, more hurried than before. You're cherry-picking tragedies to justify policies that destroy thousands of innocent lives. You're weaponizing fear and burying compassion under barbed wire. Her hands shook faintly, her words running faster, almost stumbling. We're supposed to be a beacon. We're supposed to be better than this. America doesn't close its doors on desperation. Trump didn't blink. His voice dropped even lower. America cannot feed the world if she cannot feed herself. A nation that collapses under unsustainable burdens saves no one, not those inside, not those outside. The line landed, no flourish, no aggression, just blunt calculus. Newsom leaned in, visibly tense but composed, trying to pull the discourse back. We can't build walls against humanity. We can't base security on paranoia. ICE expansion drains our treasury while shattering the values we claim to uphold internationally. Patel, eyes sharp, responded immediately. We can't build nations on fantasy either. Security isn't paranoia, it's survival. And fiscal impact. The cost of unchecked migration runs deeper than ICE line items. It crushes local hospitals, it overburdens schools, it erodes social trust. He allowed a brief pause before adding, and while we're quoting costs, perhaps we should mention the estimated $150 billion per year spent nationally on services related to illegal immigration, taxpayer funds diverted, while our veterans sleep on sidewalks. AOC's words came sharper now, but less steady. Cost? What cost can you assign to compassion? What price is too high to save a child, to give someone hope? Trump, quiet but lethal, delivered his reply without lifting his eyes. There is no compassion in collapse. There is no mercy in chaos. The room shifted. For the first time, a visible nod from moderate senators. Even those previously silent now exchanged uneasy glances. Patel added quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Borders exist for a reason. Without them, you don't have a sanctuary, you have surrender. The shift was complete. AOC's breathing was audible now, short, shallow. Newsom's hands tightened, his knuckles whitening. And though they tried to mount a response, the tone had changed. The line, the moral threshold, had been drawn. And for the first time, the upper hand belonged elsewhere. The silence that followed the collapse of AOC's last fragile defense was not one of relief. It was the stillness of inevitability. Kash Patel broke it first, not with haste, not with volume, but with a deliberate voice sharpened by the weight of undeniable fact. Let's stop pretending we're debating philosophy. We are debating survival. And survival, ladies and gentlemen, is not a metaphor, it's a body count. He held up the final dossier. Without theatrics, ICE intercepted over 11,000 kilograms of fentanyl and heroin in 12 months. That's not a policy debate, that's millions of lives not lost. ICE identified and blocked over 500 known or suspected terrorists. Those are attacks that didn't happen. ICE dismantled trafficking rings that would have enslaved over 2,000 men, women, and children. We're not talking about lines on a map. We're talking about saving human beings. The room held its breath. Trump stepped forward, pen already in hand, voice soft but unshakable. ICE doesn't just guard borders. ICE saves lives. This isn't ideology. This is duty. He opened the bill unhurried, and as he placed the pen to paper, the weight of the chamber thickened. Patel added barely above a whisper, "For every voice raised against ICE, there are voices that can still speak because of them. For every family separated by law, there are dozens protected from violence by the same law. That's not cruelty, that's governance." AOC's voice cracked as she tried to intervene. You can't define mercy in numbers. You can't legislate away humanity." Her hands trembled, her breath shuddered. Trump's gaze did not leave the parchment as he signed. Mercy without order is collapse without end. The pen met paper, one stroke, two strokes, until the signature was done. Outside, the roar of jets, silent in meaning, deafening in signal. B-2, F-22, F-35, soaring overhead, not to intimidate, but to affirm. AOC's voice fractured completely, barely audible. "You've beaten us. We couldn't stop you. We couldn't save them." Her tears fell openly now, no longer controlled her voice, barely more than breath. Newsom stood motionless, his voice lost, his head bowed. Patel stepped back, arms crossed. "We were never here to gloat. We were here to choose. And we have." Trump lowered the pen, eyes still steady, words, soft as iron laws, don't define America. But this choice, we will be remembered for this choice. No one answered. The image, ink drying one side, shattered the other, unmoved would remain. History in that moment was sealed without fanfare. The image, Trump signing, Patel standing resolute, AOC collapsing, had already traveled the globe before the ink dried. Screens across the country flickered with split reactions, while the world's capitals watched in unease. "They've done it," a CNN anchor murmured, on-air voice tinged with disbelief. "The bill has passed. The battle, at least this one, is over." Fox News, in stark contrast, framed the moment differently. America chooses sovereignty over sentiment. President Trump restores the rule of law. Kash Patel, when approached for comment, offered nothing but a quiet, "There's nothing to celebrate when duty is fulfilled. We move forward." Trump, declining interviews, released only a single line through his office. "We chose the hard path because the easy path destroys nations." The silence from the victors contrasted sharply with the unraveling of the opposition. Gavin Newsom, once defiant, vanished from media circuits, his last appearance, a grainy image of him boarding a private jet, eyes down, no comment. Within the Democratic caucus, the fractures deepened. A moderate congressman was caught on a hot mic muttering, "We lost the center. We lost the argument. We lost control." International headlines mirrored the divide. The Guardian ran America's cold heart, the death of compassion in policy. Meanwhile, the Times of London countered, "Decisive America when a nation remembers borders matter." Yet it was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez who, under mounting pressure, stood again, this time, not before a hearing, but in front of cameras, her face drawn, voice hoarse. "I fought. I fought because I believed in the better angels of this country. I fought because I thought we could be more than what we became today." She steadied herself, but her voice trembled still. "And though we lost, I will not stop, because history doesn't end here. Not with a signature, not with a silence." The reporters shifted uncomfortably. Some lowered their eyes. Some scribbled furiously. Patel, watching the clip privately, offered no comment, but his expression remained unchanged. Trump, when briefed on her words, responded simply, "She can keep fighting. We'll keep governing." The battle was over, but the war, the deeper ideological war, was only beginning to take shape beneath the headlines. The echoes of AOC's last broken words, "I will not stop," still lingered when Kash Patel, stepping into the growing stillness, spoke in a voice stripped of triumph, but heavy with certainty. Power is never immortal. Only truth survives. And sometimes truth is no more than a signature that refuses to fade. Trump, without lifting his gaze, followed without pause. We didn't take the easy path. We chose the path that keeps freedom breathing. And for those who still dream of America as free, remember, this freedom is paid for, never gifted. The Capitol steps where this confrontation unfolded had ceased to be stone. They had become the battlefield where law overcame sentiment, where decisions, not emotions, wrote the final word. The image, one man signing another, standing one breaking, spread across continents, entering history without applause, but with indelible weight. Journalists circled, asking if the conflict had ended. Patel, his expression unreadable, replied softly, "This is not the end. The legal battles, the cultural wars, those remain. History doesn't stop, it pivots." Trump, when pressed further, added with a faint smile that cut sharper than any headline, "Consensus is slow. Action writes history." As the city lights flickered beneath a darkening sky, one silent question, never spoken, but present in every glance, remained unanswered. How long can any power endure when it's not anchored to truth?